Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today and taking time out from your busy schedules to be here. My name is Valerie Rittler, and I'm a teacher in the Minneapolis Public Schools, and I'm also a member of PJAM. And I'm so pleased to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Glen Ford, who has flown in from New Jersey to be with us today. Mr. Ford has been a journalist and a political activist for over 40 years. He created the first syndicated black radio news magazine, the first syndicated black news interview program on commercial TV, and the first nationally syndicated hip-hop music show. He has served as a White House, Capitol Hill, and State Department correspondent and a Washington bureau chief, and has written a book on the U.S. invasion of Grenada. Mr. Ford was a founding member of the Washington Association of Black Journalists and a member of the Executive Committee of the National Alliance of Third World Journalists. He also co-founded Black Agenda Report, where he is currently the executive director. Mr. Ford is a true standout in the field of journalism and is well known for his principled and transparent reporting. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Glen Ford.
Thank you, and power to the people. I always say that because I think it starts the meeting off right. It's a great honor to be here with so many people who are so deeply involved, and I hope this microphone is working.
It's for the video.
Ah, that's a radio microphone. Ah, that way. So people who are so deeply involved in social transformation and our educational system and the struggle for social transformation are inseparable, and I think I'm going to try to get into that in my remarks. Public education, the very nature of public education and its existence as we have known it is today threatened as in no time in history here in the United States. What began as a narrow Republican partisan strategy to drive a wedge between teachers' unions and the black community, which are two pillars of the Democratic Party, has since then morphed into a kind of larger phenomenon, something much more dangerous, and this has happened in the past 8 years. Today, what's at stake is not just the old progressive alliance with unions and black political forces at the core of that alliance. What is at stake is the social base for support of the institution of public education itself. Today, it's not just the teachers' unions and teachers' rights as working people that are threatened, but the very existence of teaching as a profession. Corporate forces want more than just your union cards. They want to deprofessionalize the teaching workforce, period. We're not just talking about your unions and your collective bargaining rights, but what is a teacher today in today's society? Today, the charter school juggernaut, which began, as most of you probably know, as a project of upwardly mobile white parents right here in Minnesota, has warped into a politics of black communities across the country. That is, we now associate the charter school argument with the problems of inner city schools, although charter schools began as something very different. And there are reasons for that. Many parents and activists have come to see charter schools as somehow representing a kind of community control, which is broad-based and historically rooted in terms of black aspirations. This, of course, is a disastrous delusion, since the systematic privatization of school administration, in fact, destroys all possibilities for effective community control. Nevertheless, Many black folks believe that there is a potential there somehow within this charter phenomenon for some stronger kind of community control. This is a kind of state of confusion in black politics, and it's made infinitely worse by the first black president of the United States all-out offensive on charter schools. If this corporate onslaught is to be turned back, it will require that teachers and other defenders of public education expose charter schools as the antithesis of community control, the very opposite of what people aspire to, and push, excuse me, and in the process, push more aggressively for democratization of the public education process. That is, it is not enough just to expose the charter schools as a businessman's proposition. We must also work for genuinely more democratic processes within the public schools, and to open up that process to community control in ways that people can see and feel. Defeating the corporate offensive will require the igniting of a movement for truly democratic community control among the populations that are most directly affected, that is, black and brown people. If those communities do not feel that they can own the public schools, they will allow the keys to the buildings to be handed to private managers. And that is what is in fact occurring. So for teachers to save themselves and their profession, they must be part of a larger community empowerment movement. And the gentleman to my right will, I'm sure, speak in great detail about what's happening in Chicago in that regard. I know that a number of you saw the video of the talk that I did earlier this year on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was about the origins of the school privatization movement, and we must put movement in quotes. It was never really a movement at all, but a corporate project that was hatched in the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was initially conceived as a tool to weaken the Democratic Party base, and it began with the creation of an AstroTurf organization that was called the Black Alliance for Educational Options. Cory Booker, who is now the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, was a prominent person in that AstroTurf organization. He was a founding board member. He is now a surrogate for President Barack Obama on the campaign trail. So we see how that project has morphed and become very bipartisan, become part of the Democratic Party. But we won't go into all the details of this corporate-created pseudo-movement, because we did that in the video and I'm sure it's still out there. It cost the Bradley Foundation and the other corporate money bags around it in this constellation of right-wing foundations, it cost them a couple of $1 million to set up the Black Alliance for Educational Options, and that was back in the late 90s, and to populate it with black Republicans and also black Democratic opportunists like Cory Booker. Milton Friedman even kicked in a couple of $100,000. Then these same fat cats, actually an expanded circle of them, they kicked in a couple of million more dollars, and they sent the Black Alliance for Educational Options on a grand national speaking tour, and that put them on the media map, and they became a political reality. And as soon as the Bush administration took office in 2001, the Black Front Group, created by Bradley out of whole cloth, started getting millions of dollars in federal funds. All this took place in a 3-year period, from there being, there having never been a black organization that supported private school vouchers, to it becoming a national movement in the eyes of people who read newspapers. In fact, vouchers for private schools historically have been anathema to black folks, because that was the vehicle that was used in the South when desegregation was attempted to fund these segregation academies. So not only was it a non-issue in the black community, it was the territory of the enemy. Yet with the injection of $4 or $5 million, all of a sudden this becomes a movement with a base in the black community. We have to be clear, the project was still a Republican Party project, and it was seen as such. It was, in fact, George Bush's, part of George Bush's 2 programs for the black community. He only had 2. One of them was school vouchers, and he immediately funded it. And the other one was the faith-based initiative, which had a special emphasis on black preachers. And he gathered thousands of them as he set up different workshops all over the country offering money. These two initiatives, the one for the preachers and the one for school vouchers, were actually quite interrelated, because many of the preachers who lined up to get their cash also had aspirations to open up church schools that they hoped would be funded by private school vouchers. So it all came together. It was because of these preacher-based initiatives that Bush did manage to get statistically significant black support in 2004, because the preachers, and largely these were Pentecostal preachers, herded their congregations to the ballot boxes to vote for Bush and to vote for their checks. Now, all of this was at the time very upsetting to teachers. It was upsetting to the NAACP. It was upsetting to the People for the American Way. And it was very upsetting to us at Black Commentator, which was the predecessor to Black Agenda Report. We spent much of our time in the first 2 or 3 years of publication looking at this issue. And that was when the tip of the spear was school vouchers for private schools. But when we look back at that period, it was really more like the camel getting his nose under the tent. It was not a good thing, it was an upsetting thing, these advances in private school vouchers. But school vouchers did not represent by themselves an existential threat to public education. It was not a formula for a critical mass penetration of the public schools. Vouchers were also, as I said, heavily identified as a Republican project, and therefore they were of limited appeal to blacks, despite the formation of this AstroTurf Black Alliance for Educational Options. President Bush had his stamp all over it, and therefore it was seen in most black circles as anathema to us. So the effect was minimal, although we were upset at the time. The biggest impact of the school voucher offensive was in Washington, D.C. And that's because Washington, D.C. is a captive city of the federal government. And especially during the Bush era, the voucher program was able to be imposed on Black Washington. Even then, the polls showed that black folks were not in favor of school vouchers, and the democratically controlled school board also resisted these programs. But the power of the Fed, the Congress, and the executive was sufficient that they were able to be established in D.C. And D.C. now has the deepest penetration of voucher schools. However, during that period, the school voucher advocates and the charter school boosters became far more closely coordinated. The big funders saw that charter schools held a far greater potential for privatization than the voucher approach, because charterization could actually penetrate the existing system rather than laboriously, school by school, trying to set up a parallel private system that is one school at a time. And so the focus quickly, around 2003, 2004, the focus quickly changed from vouchers to charter schools. And there became a kind of consensus with the Heritage Foundation and Bradley and the Walmart family that this was the way to go. They could really draw blood this way rather than with the voucher approach. I want to pause right here because sometimes we oversimplify the right-wing threat and we distort the view of what the right-wing network is all about. Foundations like Bradley and the Heritage Foundation and the rest, they do spend billions of dollars trying to make the world safe for corporate rule. But they are also deeply ideological. That is, they get focused on a certain philosophical approach, like vouchers for private schools. They would like the world to be made up entirely of private institutions with a government with police and soldiers to enforce the rules. So philosophically, they tend to go for the private school voucher approach, even though the charter approach would be much more effective politically. But that does not apply to the people that you hear every day on the news described as markets. The markets being the rich people who actually manipulate the system for their own benefit, and they do that every day. And these people are centered on Wall Street. They are different than the fat cats, heavily ideological, at the Heritage Foundation and the Bradley Foundation and such. Much of Wall Street, excuse me, much of Wall Street is also allied with the Democratic Party. In terms of campaign contributions, Wall Street is, can be said to be to the Democrats what big energy is to the Republicans. And so the decisive change in the relationship of forces in the drive to privatize education occurred in the middle part of the last decade, as I said, 2004, 2005. And that happened because Wall Street, the markets, the traders, the hedge funders recognized that charterization of public schools could open up the entire sector of the public sphere that we call public education. They saw literally a market in the hundreds of billions of dollars and in the trillions of dollars over time. And that's when their eyes lit up, not because of philosophical position papers turned out by the Manhattan Institute, but because they saw a huge potential market. Once the Wall Street hedge funders had that kind of eureka moment, the game changed entirely and very quickly, whiplash quick for us. And I think it caught many of us by surprise with its rapidity. Charters became the darlings of Wall Street Democrats, corporate Democrats like Barack Obama. And not just Barack Obama, but Democrats in cities across the country. School privatization was suddenly a thoroughly bipartisan issue. It had been associated during the previous period with Republicans, with overtly right-wing ideologues. But now mainstream Democrats, corporate Democrats, were spouting that same line. The whole balance of forces had changed. finance capital, which is the hegemon of American economic and political life, was determined to monetize public education. That is, to make the public educational sector into a market. And much of the Democratic Party was at their service. The ferocity of President Obama's race to the top can only be understood in terms of market making, creating a market where it did not exist before. Market making is a common term on Wall Street. That is what is occurring today with our school systems. Race to the top is a blunt instrument of coercion in the service of making a market. It offers or withholds billions of dollars in educational monies based on the testing regime. Yes, of course, it's got the testing regime there, but most centrally, it is based on the state's acquiescence in opening up more charter schools. That is market making, pure and simple. So those of you who are teachers, and I think that may be most of you, your immediate enemy now, especially since 2004, 2005, when Wall Street had its eureka moment, your enemy is Wall Street, and you share that honor with the rest of the people of the world. Your most effective adversary, the one who has advanced this corporate agenda much further and much faster than his predecessor, and with much greater skill and savoir-faire, is the Democratic president, the first black president. Your union leadership does not seem to understand that, and if you hope to get through with your profession still standing, you're going to have to get rid of your union leadership. I think you knew that. Some of us already have. There should be no doubt that President Obama wants to break the unions as a force, and he wants to deprofessionalize teachers. And I'm not just inferring this, it is quite obvious from his actions. Everything that he has done shows that he has whipped himself up into a frenzy to do just that. His education secretary, everybody knows his name, his basketball buddy, Arnie Duncan, said in January of 2010 that the best thing that happened to the educational system in New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina. He said that after being education secretary for a year, intermittently playing basketball with the president, being his good buddy, and he kept his job, and I believe that means that President Obama must be assumed to agree with him that Hurricane Katrina was the best thing to happen to education in New Orleans. Now this is disaster capitalism. We were talking just a minute ago about making markets. Well, this is a different level. This is disaster capitalism. This administration seeks to disrupt public education, purposely to disrupt public education so thoroughly that it will be judged an abject failure, and the way will be made clear to impose the corporate model. This is classic disaster capitalism, but first it requires that there be rubble, and you guys are going to be among the rubble, and that is the plan. The testing regime itself is a tool of disaster capitalism. It is an algorithm created for the purpose of declaring failed schools and failed teachers and failed public education. For the corporate model to emerge, the current model must be made to fail. So we are not looking at a series of mistakes and bunglings and certainly not well-meaning but mistaken policies. We are looking at a formula for failure that is deliberately being pursued towards that end. The testing regime is a measuring stick that becomes a whipping stick, and then it becomes a demolition ball. This is not an unintended consequence, but the purposeful design of the regime. Now I'm going to say something that may disturb some people. If the goal of these so-called reforms is to equalize educational outcomes between black kids and white kids, then that will not happen. You cannot get there from here. You cannot get to an equality or anything resembling that in outcomes in education without an equalization of American society. And that's why you have not seen any broad example of significant narrowings. Now, I live in New Jersey, and many of you may have heard of the Abbott ruling, which required that heavily black and brown school districts, and that includes all of the larger cities in New Jersey, that the state will not just equalize, but spend whatever is necessary in search of outcomes that are equal. And it's a very open-ended ruling. It doesn't say you will do it within 10 years or 15 years. It says you will keep on doing that until the required reasonable results occur. Well, it has not occurred. Per pupil expenditures in the Abbott districts are higher, in fact, than in some non-Abbott districts. New Jersey is unique in that regard. But you don't see much of a narrowing of the gap because New Jersey is a profoundly unequal state in a profoundly unequal country. And you cannot narrow those gaps in a classroom. It does not work that way. Now, many people, including teachers, have drawn their main lesson, the main lesson that they have drawn from the Finnish educator, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Pasi Salzberg, the lesson that unions are not at fault in the educational failures in the United States. And that's a welcome lesson. It is correct. Unionized systems perform very well internationally, and they are not the problem here either. Unionization, that is a system in which workers' rights are protected and they have the right to collective bargaining, can never be wrong. So that is a red herring. But I believe that the most profound lessons that come out of Professor Salzberg's work, and I'm sure most of you have read it, is that educational equality and social and economic equality go hand in hand. It is a huge mistake that will always come back to haunt us, to believe that the racial gap in education can be substantially overcome when all the other gaps in society continue and in this period continue to expand. Even equalization of expenditures per pupil cannot overcome the profound inequalities of the society at large, which will be reflected in student performance. Now, that does not mean that we do not constantly try new and creative approaches to education. That certainly does not mean that we do not try to grab every dollar we can for those schools in those communities that have been historically wronged and are still wrong today. That does not mean that we tell communities that there is no hope until somehow magically there is an equalization of society. What it does mean is that as teachers, in the closest collaboration, and in fact as part of these struggling communities, as they fight for a more equal society as a whole, that they understand that what they are being judged for, that is school performance, and the progress that is made in equalizing society are one and the same struggle. And that this must also be understood within communities, that there is no magic bullet in the schools, that it cannot be expected that students who certainly if they are male, are subject to be arbitrarily arrested and stopped and frisked, who are subject to the violence that is always involved in segregated and economically deprived communities, that somehow all this or even substantial progress can be made just through curriculum. What we need, in short, is a movement for equality in America. And the educational equality is only one part of that. You cannot beat Wall Street, which is now the main enemy of your profession and of education as a whole, without the participation of the whole people. By themselves, the teachers stand not one chance in hell of winning this battle. Only in conjunction with a larger people's movement can we hope to beat this enemy, the hegemon of the world. Power to the people, and thank you.